The Battle of Gela, a German perspective. The pre-dawn darkness of the 10th of July, 1943, hung heavy over the southern coast of Sicily, a Mediterranean island that had witnessed the passage of empires for 3 millennia. The warm waters of the Mediterranean lapped gently against beaches of coarse sand and smooth pebbles, beaches that would, within hours, become killing grounds soaked with blood and littered with the debris of modern warfare. In command posts scattered across the island's interior, illuminated by the weak glow of kerosene lamps and flickering candles, German officers bent over maps marked with colored pencils and grease pencils, their faces drawn with the exhaustion of men who had slept little in recent weeks and who knew that the invasion they had anticipated for months was finally upon them. The intelligence reports had been contradictory and fragmentary, the defensive preparations incomplete despite months of labor, and the Italian allies increasingly unreliable as their faith in Benito Mussolini's fascist regime crumbled under the weight of 3 years of military disasters. Yet the professional soldiers of the Wehrmacht, hardened veterans of campaigns from the frozen steppes of Russia to the scorching deserts of North Africa, prepared to meet the Allied armada with the calculated violence and tactical sophistication that had become their trademark across 2 continents and 4 years of total war. The night air carried the scent of wild thyme and rosemary from the Sicilian hillsides, mixed with the salt tang of the sea and the acrid smell of diesel fuel from the generators that powered the German communications equipment. In the orderly room of the Hermann Goring Panzer Division headquarters, located in a requisitioned villa outside the town of Caltagirone, staff officers maintained the watch, updating situation maps as fragmentary reports arrived from coastal observation posts. The division's intelligence officer, Hauptmann Werner Schröder, had spent the evening analyzing aerial reconnaissance photographs and interrogation reports from deserters, trying to divine where the Allied blow would fall. The possibilities seemed endless. The southeastern beaches near Syracuse, the southern coast around Gela and Licata, perhaps even the western or northern shores. The Allies possessed the naval strength to land simultaneously at multiple points, overwhelming the defenders through sheer dispersion of effort. The strategic situation confronting the Axis defenders of Sicily in the summer of 1943 represented the culmination of catastrophic defeats on multiple fronts, each more devastating than the last, each consuming irreplaceable men and materiel that the overstretched German war machine could no longer replace. The surrender of Army Group Africa in Tunisia on the 13th of May had cost Germany and Italy nearly 250,000 men, including battle-hardened veterans who had fought with distinction under General Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel through 2 years of desert warfare. These were soldiers who had learned their craft in the crucible of mobile warfare across the North African littoral, men who understood tank tactics and combined arms operations, men whose experience and institutional knowledge could not be duplicated through training alone. Their loss represented not merely a numerical deficit, but a qualitative degradation of German military capability. The Eastern Front, that vast theater of annihilation stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, continued to consume entire armies in the limitless spaces of the Soviet Union. The catastrophe at Stalingrad 4 months earlier had destroyed the Sixth Army and shattered the myth of German invincibility, while the subsequent Soviet winter offensive had driven German forces back hundreds of kilometers across a front that measured thousands of kilometers in length. Every week brought reports of divisions reduced to regimental strength, of panzer formations with handfuls of operational tanks, of infantry battalions that existed only on paper. The Wehrmacht was bleeding to death in Russia, and everyone from Adolf Hitler in his headquarters to the youngest soldier in Sicily knew it. Meanwhile, Allied bombers struck with increasing frequency and devastating effect at the industrial heart of the Third Reich. The great manufacturing cities of the Ruhr and Rhineland, the aircraft factories of southern Germany, the shipyards of Hamburg and Bremen, all endured round-the-clock aerial bombardment that killed tens of thousands of civilians and disrupted war production. The Luftwaffe, once master of European skies, could no longer protect German airspace, its fighter forces ground down by attrition and increasingly outmatched by American and British aircraft that appeared in ever greater numbers. The strategic bombing campaign, combined with losses on the Eastern Front and in the Mediterranean, was strangling Germany's ability to sustain the war. Sicily, the largest island in the Mediterranean, with an area of more than 25,000 square kilometers, commanded the sea lanes between the western and eastern basins of that ancient sea. Its geographical position, jutting out from the toe of the Italian boot toward the North African coast, made it a natural stepping stone for any power seeking to project influence northward from Africa or southward from Europe. The island's ports, particularly Messina and Palermo, could support major naval operations, while its airfields provided bases for aircraft operating across the central Mediterranean. For the British, who had fought since 1940 to keep their lifeline through the Mediterranean open, Sicily's conquest would finally secure that route completely. For the Americans, it represented the next logical step in the campaign to knock Italy out of the war and open a southern front against Hitler's fortress Europe. For Adolf Hitler and the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the supreme military command that directed operations across all theaters, Sicily's defense was not merely a military necessity, but a political imperative fraught with implications for the entire Axis alliance. Italy's commitment to the war had been wavering since the disasters in Greece and North Africa, and the fascist regime's domestic position had deteriorated correspondingly. King Victor Emmanuel III and elements of the Italian military and political establishment were, German intelligence suspected, contemplating a separate peace with the Allies. The loss of Sicily, actual Italian territory rather than colonial possessions in Africa, might provide the catalyst for Italy's defection from the Axis. Such a development would be catastrophic, exposing Germany's southern flank, requiring the deployment of additional divisions to occupy Italy and the Balkans, and providing the Allies with air bases from which to strike at Germany itself. The German High Command therefore viewed Sicily's defense through multiple lenses: tactical, operational, strategic, and political. Tactically, the island had to be held long enough to inflict maximum casualties on the invaders, demonstrating that further advances up the Italian peninsula would be prohibitively costly. Operationally, Sicily served as an outpost protecting the approaches to the Italian mainland, buying time for the construction of defensive lines further north. Strategically, its retention denied the Allies a major forward base and kept pressure on their extended supply lines. Politically, a successful defense might shore up Italian morale and forestall any thoughts of surrender. These considerations shaped the defensive planning and would ultimately influence the decisions made during the Battle for Gela. The German forces committed to Sicily's defense were modest in scale by the standards of the Eastern Front, where army groups of hundreds of thousands of men fought across fronts stretching for hundreds of kilometers. But they were formidable in quality, training, and equipment. The Hermann Goring Panzer Division, named for the corpulent Reichsmarschall who commanded the Luftwaffe, and whose political influence in the Nazi hierarchy remained substantial despite his air force's declining effectiveness, had been rebuilt after its mauling in Tunisia and deployed to Sicily in early June. The division's organization reflected the evolution of German armored doctrine through 3 years of warfare. Unlike the pure panzer divisions of 1939 and 1940, which had emphasized tanks at the expense of infantry, the Hermann Goring Division balanced its panzer regiment with 2 panzer grenadier regiments, extensive artillery support, and robust engineer and anti-aircraft components. The division's 10,000 men represented a cross-section of German military capability and the Wehrmacht's increasingly diverse character. At its core were experienced non-commissioned officers and junior officers who had fought in Poland, France, the Balkans, or North Africa. Men who understood the reality of modern mechanized combat and could lead under the stress and confusion of battle. These veterans, their uniforms faded by sun and laundering, their decorations testament to survival as much as valor, provided the division's backbone. Around them were clustered younger soldiers, many in their late teens or early 20s, who had completed training in the Reich and been shipped south to fill the gaps left by casualties in Tunisia. These men brought enthusiasm and physical vigor, but lacked the combat experience that distinguished veterans from recruits. The division also included support personnel drawn from every corner of the Greater German Reich and its conquered territories, mechanics from the Sudetenland, drivers from Austria, cooks from Silesia, clerks from Bavaria. The division's equipment reflected both Germany's technological sophistication and its growing material constraints as the war stretched German industry beyond sustainable limits. The Panzer Regiment fielded approximately 90 tanks divided between 2 battalions. The 1st Battalion operated the Panzerkampfwagen IV, the workhorse of German armored forces since 1939, and now in its definitive long-barreled variant, mounting a 75mm gun capable of destroying any Allied tank at combat ranges. These Mark IVs, with their angular hulls and characteristic side skirts designed to defeat anti-tank rifle fire, had proven themselves in Russia and Africa. Their crews, typically 5 men crammed into the vehicle's interior, had developed an almost instinctive understanding of their machines, knowing every quirk of the transmission, every characteristic of the gun, every limitation of the armor. The 2nd Battalion operated a mix of Panzerkampfwagen III tanks, mounting 50mm guns that were increasingly inadequate against modern Allied armor, and a handful of the fearsome Tiger tanks, 60-ton behemoths armed with 88mm guns and protected by armor that could defeat most Allied anti-tank weapons. The Tigers, mechanical marvels that embodied German engineering excellence, were also temperamental machines that required constant maintenance and consumed fuel at prodigious rates. Their presence in the division, however, provided psychological comfort to German soldiers and instilled respect, if not outright fear, in their opponents. The Panzer Grenadier Regiment's infantry units with enhanced mobility through half-tracks and trucks numbered approximately 4,000 men equipped with the standard German infantry weapons. The Mauser Karabiner, 98K rifle, the supremely effective MG-42 machine gun that could fire 1,200 rounds per minute, the Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon, and the steel hand granate stick grenade. These men were trained to fight in close cooperation with tanks, using combined arms tactics that German doctrine emphasized and German training had perfected through years of refinement. Each Panzer Grenadier battalion included a heavy weapons company with mortars, anti-tank guns, and infantry guns, providing organic fire support that enhanced tactical flexibility. The division's artillery component consisted of 3 battalions, totaling 36 guns, a mix of 105mm howitzers and 150mm heavy howitzers. German artillery doctrine emphasized centralized control and rapid response to calls for fire, with forward observers attached to combat units and communications linking the guns to frontline commanders. The artillerymen, whose skills in surveying, ballistic calculation and fire direction required months of specialized training, took pride in their ability to place shells precisely on target with minimal adjustment. Their capabilities would prove crucial in the coming battle, providing the fire support upon which the counterattack would partially depend. The division's commander, General Major Paul Conrath, was a professional officer of the old Prussian school, methodical and competent, if lacking the dash and charisma of Germany's more celebrated panzer leaders like Erwin Rommel or Heinz Guderian. Conrad had joined the Reichswehr in the early 1920s and risen through the ranks during Germany's clandestine rearmament in the 1930s. He understood combined arms operations, the importance of logistics, and the need for thorough planning. His leadership style emphasized careful preparation, clear orders, and personal courage, visiting frontline units regularly and showing himself to his men under fire. The division's soldiers respected him as a commander who would not waste their lives carelessly, though some younger officers thought him overly cautious and unimaginative. Alongside the Hermann Goring Division stood the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division, a motorized infantry formation that had arrived in Sicily only days before the invasion. Its units still detraining and moving to assembly areas when the Allied Armada appeared offshore. This division, originally formed as part of the Africa Corps and rebuilt after Tunisia, fielded approximately 12,000 men organized in 3 motorized infantry regiments, a panzer battalion with perhaps 30 tanks and supporting arms. Its commander, General Major Eberhard Roth, was a veteran of the Eastern Front whose experience in Russia had taught him both the possibilities and the limitations of mobile warfare. The division's late arrival meant it would play a supporting rather than leading role in the defense of Sicily, but its presence provided depth to the German defensive system. These units were supported by elements of the 1st Parachute Division, elite Fallschirmjäger who had earned fearsome reputations in Crete and Russia and who embodied the aggressive spirit that German military culture prized. Parachute infantry, selected for physical fitness and mental toughness, trained to a higher standard than regular infantry and equipped with specialized weapons, represented an elite within an elite. Their presence in Sicily, though only in regimental strength, provided a mobile reserve capable of rapid deployment to threatened sectors. The paratroopers, many wearing the distinctive rimless steel helmets and ankle-length smocks that marked their branch, took fierce pride in their unit identity and their combat record. The total German strength on Sicily amounted to approximately 32,000 men, organized in 2 divisions and various independent battalions, a force that would have been adequate for occupation duties or internal security, but was manifestly insufficient to defend the island's vast coastline against a determined invasion supported by overwhelming naval and air power. The Germans faced not only numerical inferiority, but also fundamental strategic dilemmas that no amount of tactical skill could resolve. Where would the Allies strike? The island's coastline stretched for nearly 1,000 kilometers, presenting countless potential landing sites from broad, sandy beaches, ideal for amphibious operations, to rocky coves suitable only for small-scale raids. German intelligence, working from aerial reconnaissance, signals intercepts and agent reports, had identified the southeastern beaches around Syracuse and the southern coast near Gela as likely objectives, but uncertainty plagued every calculation. The defensive plan, hammered out in conferences between German and Italian commanders throughout June, reflected these constraints. Italian coastal divisions would man fixed defenses along the beaches, providing the initial resistance to any landing. These unfortunate units, composed largely of older reservists with obsolete weapons and minimal training, were expected to fight delaying actions that would disrupt the landings and buy time for mobile counterattacks. The German divisions, positioned inland beyond the range of naval gunfire, would constitute the operational reserve, ready to counterattack once the Allied landing sites became clear. This scheme assumed that the Italians would fight with determination, that communications would remain intact, that German mechanized columns could reach the coast before the invaders consolidated their beachheads, and that the Luftwaffe would provide at least some measure of air cover. Every one of these assumptions would prove optimistic. The Italian defenders, nominally more numerous with 4 coastal divisions and 2 mobile divisions totaling perhaps 70,000 men, presented a far less inspiring picture to their German allies and to themselves. The coastal divisions, responsible for manning the beach defenses that constituted the first line of resistance against any invasion, were poorly equipped with a hodgepodge of obsolete weapons, inadequately trained, with many soldiers having received only cursory instruction in modern warfare, and led by officers whose enthusiasm for Benito Mussolini's war had evaporated after 3 years of uninterrupted defeats across 3 continents. These divisions, the Napoli, Livorno, Aosta and Assietta, bore Italian names redolent with historical glory, but possessed little combat capability by the standards of mid-war mechanized warfare. A typical Italian coastal battalion in July 1943 consisted of perhaps 400 men armed with rifles that dated to the First World War, a handful of machine guns of equally ancient vintage, and a few mortars. Anti-tank capability was virtually non-existent, with most units possessing only a few obsolete 47mm guns that could not penetrate modern armor. Artillery support was sporadic and inadequate, often consisting of guns captured from the Austrians in 1918 or even older pieces. The defensive positions themselves, while extensive on paper, often consisted of poorly constructed bunkers, thin minefields with inadequate density, and wire obstacles that would slow but not stop a determined attacker. The soldiers who manned these positions, many of them older reservists recalled to service or young conscripts with minimal training, understood that their weapons and fortifications would be grossly inadequate against a modern, mechanized invasion force supported by naval gunfire and air power. Morale among Italian troops had declined precipitously since the heady days of June 1940, when Italy had entered the war, expecting quick victories and easy conquests. 3 years of defeats in Greece, North Africa and Russia had shattered any illusions about Italian military prowess or fascist invincibility. The soldiers knew that their allies, the Germans, regarded them with contempt, a sentiment the Germans barely bothered to conceal. They knew that their government had led them into a war that served German rather than Italian interests. They knew that their families at home endured Allied bombing and economic privation. Most fundamentally, they no longer believed in the cause for which they were being asked to die. This psychological collapse, as much as material deficiency, would doom Italian resistance when the invasion came. The 2 mobile Italian divisions, Livorno and Napoli, possessed marginally better equipment and training than their coastal counterparts, but remained woefully inadequate by the standards of modern mobile warfare. Their tanks were mostly obsolete models, mounting guns that could not penetrate Allied armor. Their trucks were in poor mechanical condition, and their tactical doctrine had not evolved to incorporate the lessons of mobile mechanized combat that the Germans had learned through years of warfare. German commanders planning operations in Sicily therefore assumed that Italian units would serve primarily as cannon fodder, delaying Allied advances and buying time for German counterattacks to restore the situation. This brutal calculus, while unstated in official communications, shaped every aspect of German operational planning. The terrain of southern Sicily, that ancient landscape where Greeks and Romans, Byzantines and Arabs, Normans and Spaniards had fought for control across millennia, favored the defender in ways that partially compensated for material inferiority. Inland from the beaches, the ground rose in a series of ridges and hills toward the island's mountainous interior, offering observation points from which defenders could spot approaching enemies and defensive positions where infantry could shelter from artillery fire. The road network, primitive by Central European standards and consisting mainly of narrow, unpaved tracks, channeled movement along predictable axes that could be covered by defensive fire. River valleys, their beds often dry in the summer heat, but their banks steep and difficult for vehicles, provided natural obstacles. The towns and villages, with their stone buildings and narrow streets, could be turned into strongpoints that would require time-consuming assaults to reduce. The summer climate added another dimension to the operational environment. July in Sicily brought searing heat that could reach 40 degrees Celsius, heat that exhausted soldiers and overheated vehicle engines. The terrain was parched, with vegetation withered and brown, providing little concealment but generating clouds of dust that betrayed every movement. Water sources were scarce, limiting the capacity of forces to operate away from established supply lines. For attackers coming ashore from ships, the heat and dust would compound the disorientation and fatigue inherent in amphibious operations. For defenders, the climate necessitated careful husbanding of water supplies and imposed its own constraints on sustained combat operations. The beaches themselves varied dramatically in character, a fact that would significantly influence the course of the invasion. Some beaches were broad expanses of fine sand, gently sloping into shallow water, ideal for landing craft and the rapid debarkation of men and vehicles. Others were narrower strips of coarse gravel backed by seawalls or sand dunes that could shelter defenders and provide obstacles to vehicles. Some sectors featured rocky outcrops that would limit landing sites to specific points, creating natural choke points where defenders could concentrate their fire. German engineers, working since the spring, had fortified key sectors with mines, wire obstacles, anti-tank ditches, and concrete bunkers. But the sheer extent of the coastline, nearly 1,000 kilometers, made comprehensive fortification impossible. Resources were limited, time was short, and the strategic uncertainty about where the Allies would land necessitated dispersing defensive efforts across multiple sectors. The Allied armada that appeared off Sicily's coast in the early hours of July 10th represented the largest amphibious operation yet attempted in warfare, a massive projection of maritime power that dwarfed even the great naval operations of previous centuries. More than 2,000 ships carried 8 divisions of American and British troops, totaling approximately 160,000 men, supported by overwhelming naval gunfire from battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, and covered by air superiority so complete that the Luftwaffe could mount only token resistance. The invasion fleet stretched across dozens of kilometers of sea, an armada whose size and power reflected the industrial might of the United States and the organizational capacity of the Anglo-American alliance. The American 7th Army, commanded by Lieutenant General George Smith Patton, Jr., a cavalry officer whose aggressive temperament and showmanship masked genuine tactical ability, would land on the southern coast with 3 divisions abreast. The 1st Infantry Division, veteran unit that had spearheaded the landings in North Africa 8 months earlier, would target the beaches around Gela, a town of approximately 30,000 inhabitants that served as a minor port and the administrative center for the surrounding agricultural region. The 45th Infantry Division would land to the west near Scogliti, while the 3rd Infantry Division would strike further west near Licata. The British 8th Army, under General Bernard Law Montgomery, arguably the most celebrated British commander of the war, would land on the southeastern coast near Syracuse with 4 divisions, including elite formations like the 51st Highland Division. For the German defenders, isolated in their command posts and observation positions, the scale of the invasion was immediately apparent once dawn revealed the enormous fleet offshore. Observation posts along the coast, those that had not been destroyed or abandoned during the preliminary bombardment, reported endless streams of ships emerging from the darkness, their number suggesting not a raid or feint, but a full-scale invasion designed to conquer the island. The psychological impact of witnessing such overwhelming force, such manifest material superiority, was profound even for veteran German soldiers who had fought against numerical odds before. This was different from battles on the Eastern Front, where Soviet superiority in numbers was balanced by German advantages in training and tactical skill. Here, the Allies possessed not only numerical superiority, but also qualitative equality, or even superiority in equipment, doctrine, and leadership. The initial German response to the landings was fragmented and reactive, hampered by the breakdown of communications, the collapse of Italian units, and the sheer speed with which the Allies established their beachheads. Communications with Italian coastal units, never robust even in peacetime, broke down almost immediately as naval gunfire and aerial bombardment pulverized command posts, severed telephone lines, and destroyed radio equipment. The naval bombardment in particular exceeded anything the defenders had anticipated. Battleships firing shells weighing more than 1 ton, cruisers with rapid-fire guns that could obliterate entire sectors of trench line, destroyers that crept close to shore to engage point targets with devastating accuracy, all combined to create a curtain of fire that made coordinated defense nearly impossible. Italian soldiers, cowering in their inadequate bunkers or shallow trenches, found themselves subjected to a level of violence that their training and equipment had not prepared them to withstand. Many simply fled, abandoning their positions and streaming inland. Others surrendered at the first opportunity, emerging from cover with white flags or raised hands, eager to exchange the horror of bombardment for the relative safety of captivity. The Hermann Goring Division, positioned in assembly areas near Caltagirone, some 30 kilometers from the coast, received fragmentary and contradictory reports throughout the early morning hours of July 10th. The division's communications network, normally efficient and well-practiced, struggled to make sense of the chaotic situation. Some messages indicated that Italian units were holding firm and engaging the invaders. Others reported wholesale desertions and the complete collapse of coastal defenses. Radio intercepts of Allied communications, when they could be decrypted and translated, suggested that multiple landing sites had been established along both the southern and southeastern coasts. The division's intelligence section, working with insufficient information and under mounting pressure, attempted to construct a coherent picture of Allied intentions and capabilities, but the fog of war remained impenetrable. The division's operations officer, Oberstleutnant Ernst Günther Bade, a veteran of campaigns in France and Russia, whose organizational abilities and tactical acumen had earned him rapid promotion, struggled to assemble a response plan. The division could not defend everywhere. It would have to concentrate its efforts at the most critical landing site. But which site was most critical? The British landings in the southeast threatened Syracuse and the vital Straits of Messina, the narrow passage between Sicily and the Italian mainland. The American landings around Gela threatened to drive inland and cut the island in half. Both required immediate response, but the division possessed neither the strength nor the mobility to respond to both simultaneously. By mid-morning on July 10th, the situation at Gela had clarified sufficiently for German commanders to make operational decisions. American forces, identified as elements of the 1st Infantry Division through captured documents and prisoner interrogations, had established a substantial beachhead approximately 4 kilometers deep and 6 kilometers wide. Italian resistance along the coast had been negligible. Most defending units had either surrendered or dissolved. The Americans were bringing ashore armor, artillery, and supplies with impressive efficiency, their landing craft shuttling continuously between the ships offshore and the beaches, their beach organizations working through the inevitable confusion with practiced competence. More ominously, American units were already pushing inland, their patrols and advance guards probing for weak points in the defenses and seeking to expand the beachhead before the Germans could organize effective counterattacks. What became clear to the German command by noon on July 10th was that the window of opportunity for defeating the invasion was narrow and closing rapidly. Amphibious operations are at their most vulnerable in the first 24 to 48 hours, before the attacker has fully consolidated his lodgment and brought ashore his full complement of heavy weapons and supplies. After that period, the attacker's advantages in material and firepower typically become overwhelming, making counterattacks prohibitively costly. The Germans therefore had perhaps a day, perhaps only hours, to mount a decisive counterattack that could drive the Americans back to their ships. Delay would be fatal. Immediate action, however risky, offered the only chance of success. General Major Conrath, receiving his orders from the German command structure in Sicily and ultimately from the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht in Germany, issued his operational directive with the characteristic precision that marked German staff work. The Hermann Goring Division would attack toward Gela with maximum force and minimum delay. The objective was straightforward: break through to the coast, split the American beachhead, destroy the landing operations on the beaches, and drive the invaders back into the sea. The means to achieve this objective would be the concentration of overwhelming combat power at the decisive point, a principle of war that Prussian military theorists had articulated a century earlier and that German doctrine had refined through decades of study and practice. The division's combat strength would be organized into two battle groups, flexible combined arms formations that embodied German tactical doctrine. Each battle group would be built around a panzer battalion of approximately 40 tanks, reinforced with a Panzer Grenadier battalion of approximately 600 infantry, an artillery battalion of 12 guns, engineer support, and anti-aircraft elements. These battle groups, designated Kampfgruppe Schmalz and Kampfgruppe Konrad after their commanders, would advance along parallel routes converging on Gela from the northwest and northeast respectively. The two-pronged approach would disperse American defensive efforts, create opportunities for mutual support between the battle groups, and provide flexibility to exploit success wherever it developed. Kampfgruppe Schmalz, commanded by Oberst Wilhelm Schmalz, a hard-driving officer whose experience in Russia had taught him the value of speed and audacity in mobile operations, would advance from the northwest along the coastal road that connected the interior to Gela. This route offered the advantage of being the most direct approach to the town, and the one that would bring German forces most quickly to the American beachhead. The disadvantage was that it was also the most obvious avenue of approach, the one that American commanders would certainly anticipate and prepare to defend. Schmalz, however, counted on speed and shock to overcome prepared defenses, trusting in the combat power of his panzers and the tactical skill of his panzer grenadiers to punch through American positions before they could properly solidify. Kampfgruppe Konrad, which the division commander would personally accompany to exercise direct control over the main effort, would advance from the northeast along a secondary road that wound through the Sicilian countryside. This route was longer and more circuitous, but offered better concealment from American observation and would bring German forces to Gela's eastern approaches, potentially catching the defenders by surprise. The plan embodied the aggressive spirit of German operational doctrine: concentrate superior combat power at the decisive point, overwhelm the enemy through shock and firepower, exploit success ruthlessly, and never give the enemy time to recover his balance or reorganize his defenses. That American forces in the beachhead likely outnumbered the attacking Germans was deemed irrelevant. Audacity and professional skill would compensate for numerical disadvantage, as they had so often before in German military experience. The operational plan required the battle groups to be ready to move by late afternoon on July 10th, with the attack commencing at first light on July 11th if tactical conditions permitted an earlier start. This timeline was extraordinarily compressed, allowing barely 6 hours for units to prepare for a major offensive operation. Ammunition needed to be distributed, fuel tanks topped off, maintenance performed on vehicles, final reconnaissance conducted, orders issued down to platoon and squad level, and 100 other tasks completed. German staff procedures, honed through years of practice, enabled this rapid preparation, but the time pressure inevitably meant that preparations would be less thorough than doctrine prescribed. The division's logistics officer, Oberst Friedrich Müller, faced particular challenges in preparing the division for offensive operations. The distance from division supply dumps to the forward assembly areas exceeded 20 kilometers, requiring multiple trips by the division's truck companies to move forward the ammunition, fuel, and supplies that combat units would need. The roads, narrow and unpaved in many sections, limited the flow of traffic and created bottlenecks that slowed the movement of supplies. Allied air activity, while not continuous, posed a constant threat to supply columns, forcing trucks to move individually or in small groups rather than in efficient convoys, and to seek cover whenever aircraft appeared overhead. Despite these challenges, German logistics personnel, drawing on years of experience in supporting mobile operations, managed to position adequate supplies forward by early evening on July 10th, enabling the attack to proceed as scheduled. The advance began in the searing heat of late morning on July 10th, with the temperature already climbing past 35 degrees Celsius and the sun beating down mercilessly on the Sicilian landscape. Panzer crews, buttoning up their vehicles and sealing themselves inside steel ovens where temperatures could exceed 50 degrees, rolled forward with the mechanical confidence of steel beasts bred for war. The Mark IV Panzers, their long 75mm guns capable of destroying any Allied tank at combat ranges exceeding 1,000 meters, moved in tactical formation with approximately 50 meters between vehicles, their commanders standing in their open cupolas to maintain situational awareness. Despite the vulnerability, this exposed them to enemy fire. Behind the panzers came the half-tracks carrying panzer grenadiers, their soldiers sitting on the benches in the open-topped vehicles with their weapons ready and their faces set with the grim determination of men advancing into battle who knew that many would not return. The artillery batteries displaced forward from their bivouac positions, their towing vehicles straining to pull the heavy guns through the dust and heat, positioning themselves to provide fire support when the battle was joined. For the veterans among the attacking force, men who had fought through Poland and France, who had endured the frozen hell of the Russian winter and the scorching desolation of the North African desert, this was familiar work. The practiced choreography of combined arms warfare that German doctrine emphasized, and German training had perfected over years of refinement. They knew their roles instinctively, the tank commanders scanning for targets and threats, the gunners tracking with their sights, the loaders preparing ammunition, the drivers navigating the terrain while keeping their vehicles in formation. The infantry knew when to advance and when to take cover, when to concentrate fire and when to maneuver, when to call for support and when to press forward independently. The artillerymen knew how to compute firing data, how to establish communications with forward observers, how to prepare ammunition for rapid fire. This institutional knowledge, this collective competence built through years of warfare, represented Germany's greatest military asset, even as its material superiority eroded under the weight of Allied production. A letter written by Unteroffizier Klaus Weber, a tank commander in the 2nd Company of the 1st Panzer Battalion, captured the mood of those hours with a frankness that military censors would normally have suppressed, but which survived in personal papers recovered after the war. We moved out at 1100 hours, knowing that everything depended on the next 24 hours. The American landing had been massive, perhaps the largest we had ever seen, but they were still disorganized, still vulnerable on those beaches where their ships crowded together and their supplies piled up waiting to be moved inland. If we could hit them hard before they consolidated, before they brought all their tanks and guns ashore, we could throw them back into the sea. Our company commander, Hauptmann Richter, a man who had been with the regiment since Poland, told us that this was the decisive moment, that the Führer himself was watching, that the fate of Sicily and perhaps of Italy itself depended on our success. We checked our ammunition loads, verified our radio frequencies, tested our weapon systems, and rolled forward. The heat was brutal, turning the interior of the tank into an oven, the dust choking, rising in clouds that made it difficult to see and harder to breathe. But we were professionals. We had done this before in Russia, in Africa. We would do our duty, accomplish our mission, or die in the attempt. The first contact with American forces came sooner than expected, barely 4 kilometers into the advance, when the lead elements of Kampfgruppe Schmalz encountered Italian infantry falling back from the coast in disorder. These retreating soldiers, many having discarded their weapons and equipment, reported that enemy troops had already pushed several kilometers inland from the beaches and were advancing with tanks and motorized infantry. The Italian accounts, garbled and contradictory, suggested that American strength was greater than German intelligence had estimated and that their advance guard was probing aggressively rather than consolidating defensively. This information, relayed back to division headquarters by radio, prompted concern but did not alter the fundamental plan. The Germans would press forward, engage the Americans wherever they found them, and fight through to the coast. German reconnaissance elements, moving ahead of the main body in armored cars and motorcycle combinations, soon made contact with American patrols. Sharp firefights erupted as the opposing forces probed each other's strength and dispositions, each side seeking to identify weak points and report enemy locations. The distinctive crack of tank guns echoed across the Sicilian countryside as German panzers engaged American Sherman tanks at long range, their superior guns giving them an advantage in these initial duels. Several Shermans, their armor penetrated by German 75mm shells, burst into flames, their crews bailing out and running for cover. But for every Sherman destroyed, American artillery responded with increasing volume and accuracy, their forward observers calling down fire on German positions with professional competence that matched German standards. As the German columns approached the outskirts of Gela and the expanded American perimeter, they encountered increasing resistance that suggested the Americans had used the hours since landing to establish coherent defensive positions. American infantry dug into hastily prepared foxholes and weapon pits along ridgelines and in farmhouses, engaged the advancing panzers with anti-tank guns, bazookas, and rifle grenades. The American bazooka, a shoulder-fired rocket weapon that could penetrate tank armor at close range, represented a significant threat to German armor, forcing the panzers to maintain their distance from enemy infantry or advance with their own infantry in close support. The countryside erupted with the cacophony of modern mechanized warfare, the crack of tank guns firing, the rattle of machine guns, the crump of mortar rounds exploding, the whistle and crash of artillery shells, and above it all, the diesel roar of engines and the clank of tank tracks. The battle had begun in earnest, not as the clean mechanized breakthrough that German doctrine prescribed and German planners had hoped for, but as a grinding contest of firepower and determination where material superiority increasingly trumped tactical skill. The Panzer Grenadiers dismounted from their half-tracks, which withdrew to safer positions, and advanced on foot through the broken terrain, using every fold in the ground, every stone wall, every irrigation ditch for cover as they worked their way forward under fire. They moved in the practiced manner of veteran infantry, scouts advancing to identify enemy positions, squads providing covering fire while other squads maneuvered, platoon leaders directing their men with hand signals and shouted commands barely audible above the din of battle. When they encountered American positions, they assaulted with grenades and close-range automatic weapons fire, clearing enemy foxholes and weapon pits in vicious small unit actions that tested the courage and skill of individual soldiers. The Panzers provided overwatch from positions where their thick frontal armor was mostly proof against American anti-tank weapons, their guns systematically destroying targets of opportunity, machine gun nests, anti-tank gun positions, mortar teams, any American strongpoint that could be identified. The Panzer crews, working with the efficiency of long practice, maintained rates of fire that consumed ammunition rapidly but kept American defenders suppressed. Each shot followed a practiced sequence, the commander identifying the target, the gunner laying the gun using his telescopic sight, the loader ramming a shell into the breech, the gunner firing and immediately seeking his next target while the loader prepared another round. The best crews could fire 4 or 5 rounds per minute, a rate that required perfect coordination and absolute discipline under the stress of combat. The ferocity and professional competence of the German assault initially made progress against American forces still organizing after the chaos of the landing. American units, some of which had been ashore for only hours, and were still sorting out their equipment and establishing their command structures, gave ground in several sectors under the weight of the German attack. Individual American companies and battalions, finding themselves engaged by superior German forces, fell back to secondary positions or called desperately for artillery support and reinforcements. The Western Battle Group, Kampfgruppe Schmalz, pushed to within 2 kilometers of Gela's outskirts, close enough that panzer commanders standing in their open cupolas could see the town's buildings and the massive shipping clustered offshore, their masts and superstructures visible above the coastal plain. For a brief moment in the late afternoon of July 10th, success seemed within grasp. Orders circulated among German units to prepare for the final push into the town, where house-to-house fighting would neutralize American advantages in artillery and naval gunfire by forcing close-quarters combat where German superiority in tactical training could be decisive. The momentum of the attack, that intangible quality that sometimes carries armies beyond their apparent capabilities, seemed to be working its familiar magic. Officers pushed their men forward, ignoring casualties, focusing on the objective. Tank commanders urged their drivers to greater speed, their gunners to faster rates of fire. The assault was reaching its culminating point, that moment where success or failure hung in the balance, and where one more push, one more burst of energy might tip the scales decisively. Yet even as German spearheads approached their objectives, the tactical situation was deteriorating in ways that would ultimately prove fatal to the counterattack. American artillery, initially disorganized and operating in battery or battalion increments without centralized coordination, began to respond with devastating effectiveness as fire direction centers established communications and began to mass fires on German concentrations. American doctrine emphasized centralized control of artillery, allowing multiple batteries and even battalions to fire simultaneously on single targets, creating concentrations of fire that German artillery, typically firing in support of specific maneuver units, could not match. The countryside around the German advance routes became a landscape of explosions as American 105mm shells, fired from battalion after battalion of field artillery that had been brought ashore during the morning, deluged German positions. More devastating still was the naval gunfire that began to walk back from the beaches toward the German columns as spotters aboard ships and onshore identified targets and called for fire. The naval guns, enormous weapons mounted on cruisers and battleships that could hurl shells weighing hundreds of pounds across distances exceeding 20 kilometers, possessed destructive power that exceeded anything in the German arsenal. A single salvo from a heavy cruiser, 6 or 8 shells falling within seconds of each other across an area the size of a football field, could obliterate an entire company position, reducing men and machines to scattered wreckage. The psychological impact of naval gunfire, that distinctive shrieking descent of massive shells, followed by explosions that seemed to shake the earth itself, was profound even for veteran soldiers who had endured artillery fire in Russia and North Africa. Oberleutnant Friedrich Hartmann, a company commander in the 2nd Battalion of the 1st Panzer Grenadier Regiment, recorded his impressions of the naval bombardment in a letter written days after the battle to his wife in Germany, a letter that survived in family papers and provides a rare glimpse into the experience of soldiers under fire. The naval fire was unlike anything we had experienced in Russia or Africa. In Russia, Soviet artillery could be heavy, massed concentrations that caught you in the open and killed without mercy. But it came from guns we could understand, weapons similar to our own, even if more numerous. In Africa, British artillery was professional and accurate, directed by skilled gunners who knew their craft, but again it was comprehensible, human scale. But this was something beyond our experience. The shells seemed to come from nowhere, from guns so distant we could not see them, arriving with only a moment's warning, massive explosions that killed everyone within 50 meters and wounded or stunned everyone within 100. We lost an entire platoon, 42 men, in seconds when a salvo landed directly on their position. The men began to look nervously at the sky, flinching at sounds, listening for the whistle that meant death was falling on them. It was impossible to dig in. The ground was too hard and there was no time. It was impossible to maneuver. Any movement drew fire. We could only advance and hope that speed would carry us through the fire, or take cover and hope the next salvo would land elsewhere. The Eastern Battle Group, Kampfgruppe Konrad, advancing parallel to Schmalz's formation along a route that took it through more rugged terrain, encountered even stiffer resistance that suggested American defensive preparations had progressed further in this sector. American paratroopers, scattered across the countryside during the chaotic night drop that had preceded the amphibious landings, had coalesced into ad hoc defensive positions that belied their dispersed landings. These were soldiers of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, elite troops selected for physical fitness and mental toughness, trained for independent action, and equipped with a higher proportion of automatic weapons than standard infantry. They had spent the day since landing organizing themselves, establishing communications, identifying German approach routes, and preparing ambush positions that exploited the broken terrain. The paratroopers fought with the resourcefulness and aggressiveness that characterized elite units throughout the war. Machine gun positions, carefully sited in stone farmhouses that provided both cover and fields of fire, opened up at ranges where their fire would be most effective, forcing the German infantry to deploy from column into assault formation and reducing the speed of the advance. Mortar teams, operating from concealed positions in orchards and behind stone walls, dropped rounds among the advancing Germans with accuracy that suggested professional fire direction. American Bazoo teams moved forward to engage the panzers at close range, accepting the risk of German machine gun and cannon fire to get within the 100-meter effective range of their weapons. The fighting in this sector developed into a series of sharp, vicious small unit actions, squad against squad, platoon against platoon, where tactical skill and personal courage counted more than numerical superiority or technological advantage. The panzers of Kampfgruppe Konrad, attempting to maintain momentum and provide support to their embattled infantry, found themselves channeled onto narrow country roads where maneuver was impossible, and every movement was observed by American spotters. Several Markefes threw tracks after striking mines that American engineers had hastily planted during the morning, the disabled vehicles blocking the advance routes and forcing units behind them to wait while recovery crews worked under fire to clear the obstacles. Other tanks, advancing too quickly or without adequate infantry support, found themselves isolated and vulnerable to ambush by American anti-tank teams. A Tiger tank, one of only 3 with Kampfgruppe Konrad and a vehicle whose combat power exceeded any single American tank by a wide margin, threw a track while attempting to maneuver off-road, its 70-ton bulk settling immobile in a vineyard where it would remain until the end of the battle, its crew evacuated, but the tank itself a total loss. By mid-afternoon on July 10th, with the sun beginning its descent toward the western horizon and the temperature still exceeding 30 degrees, the German attack along both axes had stalled well short of its objectives. Neither Kampfgruppe Schmalz nor Kampfgruppe Konrad had reached Gela, and neither had succeeded in breaking through American defensive lines to reach the coast. German casualties, while not catastrophic by the standards of the Eastern Front, where divisions could lose thousands of men in a single day, were mounting steadily and included irreplaceable specialists. Tank commanders killed by sniper fire while standing in their cupolas, forward observers cut down while directing artillery fire, experienced non-commissioned officers who died leading assaults against American positions. The division's casualty clearing stations, established in villages several kilometers behind the advancing forces, reported a steady stream of wounded men arriving by half-track and truck, soldiers with shrapnel wounds, burns from knocked-out vehicles, the 1,000 small injuries that accumulated in mechanized combat. More seriously for the division's continued combat effectiveness, losses in armor were reaching critical levels. A dozen panzers had been destroyed outright, their hulls burning or their interiors wrecked by penetrating hits that killed or wounded their crews. Another dozen were damaged or immobilized, requiring recovery and repair work that would take days if parts were available and if facilities could be found. Several batteries of self-propelled artillery had been overrun or forced to displace under fire, losing guns that could not be easily replaced. The attrition rate, if sustained, would reduce the Hermann Goring Division to combat ineffectiveness within days, long before achieving any strategic objective. The ammunition expenditure, particularly for tank and artillery ammunition, had been higher than anticipated by the division's logistics planners, a predictable consequence of the intensity of combat, but one that raised immediate concerns about sustainability. German doctrine prescribed standard ammunition loads for different types of operations, and the division had deployed with what planners considered adequate stocks. But the reality of combat against well-equipped American forces supported by overwhelming firepower meant that actual consumption exceeded doctrinal norms. Tank crews, engaging multiple targets and firing more rounds than they would have in training or against less capable opponents, were depleting their onboard ammunition faster than resupply could replenish it. Artillery batteries, responding to calls for fire from multiple units and attempting to suppress American positions, were burning through shells at rates that threatened to exhaust division stocks within days. Fuel consumption presented another challenge that would become increasingly critical. German panzers, particularly the heavier models, consumed fuel prodigiously even under ideal conditions. And the stop-and-start nature of combat operations, the constant maneuvering and positioning, the extended periods running engines at high RPM, all increased consumption beyond normal rates. The division's fuel trucks, making the hazardous journey from supply dumps in the rear to forward positions under threat of American air attack, could barely keep pace with demand. If combat continued at current intensity, fuel shortages would begin limiting operations within 48 hours regardless of other factors. General Major Conrath, receiving reports from his battle group commanders and assessing the situation from his command post in a farmhouse several kilometers behind the front lines, faced the classic dilemma of the offensive commander: whether to reinforce what was clearly a failing attack or to cut losses, break contact, and regroup for operations under more favorable conditions. The tactical situation offered no clear answer. The attack had not achieved its objectives. Casualties and equipment losses were significant, and American strength appeared greater than initial estimates. Moreover, American forces had used the day to strengthen their positions, bring additional forces ashore, and organize their firepower in ways that would make any renewal of the assault even more costly than the initial effort. Yet German military culture, shaped by a century of Prussian and then German military tradition, emphasized offensive action as the primary means of achieving decisive results. The concept of Bewegungskrieg, war of movement, privileged aggressive maneuver over static defense. The principle of seizing and maintaining the initiative prescribed attacking rather than waiting to be attacked. The operational doctrine developed between the wars and refined through the campaigns in Poland, France, and Russia stressed the importance of relentless offensive pressure that never gave the enemy time to recover or consolidate. To abandon the attack after a single day, to cede the initiative to the Americans without exhausting every possible effort, would have been professionally unthinkable for a German commander trained in this tradition. Moreover, the strategic situation offered Conrath no attractive alternatives. Withdrawing to defensive positions inland would concede the American beachhead and allow them to expand their lodgment at leisure, eventually building overwhelming strength for a drive across Sicily. The Italians had already proven incapable of contesting the American advance, and no other German units were available to relieve the Hermann Goring Division. If the division did not drive the Americans back into the sea, no one would. The weight of strategic necessity, combined with professional military culture and perhaps personal considerations about reputation and career, led Conrath to the decision that aggressive commanders throughout history have made in similar circumstances: attack again, harder, with whatever forces remained available. Fresh orders went out to all subordinate units in the late afternoon and early evening of July 10th. Units were to reorganize during the hours of darkness, incorporating losses, redistributing ammunition and fuel, preparing vehicles for renewed combat, and positioning themselves for an attack at first light on July 11th. The objective remained unchanged: break through to Gela, destroy the American beachhead, drive the invaders back to their ships. That such an outcome was increasingly improbable, that American strength was growing hourly, while German capabilities diminished with every casualty and destroyed tank, did not factor substantially into the decision. The logic of offensive doctrine, once set in motion, developed its own momentum independent of tactical realities. The night of July 10th passed in tense activity as units throughout the Hermann Goring Division worked to prepare for the morning's assault. German units pulled back slightly from their most forward positions, seeking cover from the naval gunfire that continued sporadically throughout the darkness. The massive shells still falling among German positions, even when spotters could not directly observe targets. American artillery fire also continued intermittently, harassing fires designed to prevent German rest and resupply, and to keep defenders constantly alert and exhausted. The crack and rumble of explosions echoed across the Sicilian countryside through the night, punctuated by the occasional burst of machine gun fire as nervous sentries engaged shadows or as patrols from both sides made contact in the darkness. The division's medical services worked through the night, evacuating wounded from forward aid stations to clearing stations further in the rear. The medical personnel moving along darkened roads in ambulances and trucks, risking American fire to bring casualties to facilities where they could receive surgery and definitive care. The wounded arrived in a steady stream, men with limbs shattered by shell fragments, burns covering their bodies from knocked-out vehicles, sucking chest wounds from bullets and shrapnel, the massive trauma that modern weapons inflicted on human bodies. Surgeons and medical orderlies, working by the light of kerosene lamps in improvised operating rooms, in farmhouses and barns, did what they could to save lives and alleviate suffering, knowing that many of their patients would die, regardless of their efforts, and that the morning would bring a fresh flood of casualties. The dead were buried in hasty graves near where they fell, their personal effects collected for eventual transmission to families in Germany, their names and service numbers recorded by unit clerks for the casualty reports that would eventually make their way through the military bureaucracy to the families waiting at home. German military tradition required that the dead be treated with dignity and that their sacrifice be acknowledged, even in the chaos of combat. Small groups of soldiers, detailed from their units for burial duties, dug graves in the hard Sicilian soil and lowered their comrades into the earth, sometimes with brief words from a chaplain if one was available, more often with only the stark rituals of military funerals and the unspoken recognition that any of them might occupy similar graves within hours. Ammunition and fuel trucks navigated the bomb-cratered roads to reach forward units, their drivers displaying the sort of quiet courage that characterized rear echelon personnel throughout the war, men who faced danger without the training or weapons of combat soldiers, but who kept armies functioning through their unglamorous but essential work. The trucks moved without lights to avoid American observation, drivers navigating by familiarity with roads they had traveled during the day and by the occasional flare or explosion that illuminated the landscape in brief, garish flashes. American air patrols operated even at night, and the sound of aircraft engines sent truck convoys scattering to the sides of roads, drivers hiding their vehicles under trees or behind buildings and hoping that they had not been spotted before taking cover. Tank crews performed maintenance on their vehicles, the work continuing through the night by feel as much as by sight, as lights could not be used near the front lines. They checked track tension, replaced damaged road wheels, tightened loose bolts, added oil to engines, performed the 100 small tasks that kept mechanical vehicles operational. Crews cleaned their weapons, removing the accumulated carbon fouling from guns that had fired scores or hundreds of rounds, checking that recoil mechanisms functioned properly, that ammunition racks were secure, that communications equipment worked. The work was exhausting, coming after a full day of combat, but it was necessary if the panzers were to be ready for the morning's assault. The Panzer Grenadiers, finding what cover they could in buildings and orchards, tried to snatch a few hours of sleep, soldiers collapsing wherever they could find a space that offered some protection from artillery fire. Sleep came fitfully, if at all, interrupted by American harassing fire, by the need to stand watch, by the adrenaline and stress that made rest impossible even when opportunity presented itself. They cleaned their weapons in darkness, field-stripping rifles and machine guns, wiping away dirt and powder residue, checking that magazines and ammunition belts functioned properly. They redistributed ammunition, taking rounds from the dead and wounded, ensuring that every man had full ammunition pouches before the morning. They wrote brief letters home if they had paper and pencil, knowing that these might be their last communications with families they might never see again. In command posts from division level down to company, officers studied maps and refined their plans for the morning assault, incorporating lessons from the day's fighting and attempting to adjust tactics to account for American capabilities they had encountered. Intelligence officers collated reports from units, attempting to update their estimates of American strength and dispositions, marking on maps the positions of enemy tanks, artillery batteries, observation posts. Operations officers calculated ammunition requirements, coordinated fire support plans, established phase lines and objectives. Communications officers tested radio nets, ensured that frequencies were properly assigned, that code words were understood. The staff work continued through the night, officers and enlisted men functioning on coffee and nerves, driven by the professional imperative to prepare their units as thoroughly as possible for the coming battle. The American forces, meanwhile, had spent the night consolidating their positions and bringing ashore the reinforcements and supplies that would make their beachhead impregnable. More armor rumbled off landing ships onto the beaches, Sherman tanks and tank destroyers adding to the American strength. Artillery battalions established firing positions and registered on likely German approach routes, their forward observers coordinating with infantry commanders to ensure that fire support would be immediately available when needed. Infantry battalions strengthened their defensive positions, digging deeper foxholes, establishing interlocking fields of fire, laying additional mines along expected German axes of advance. Supply dumps grew on the beaches as landing craft shuttled back and forth between ships and shore, stacking ammunition, fuel, rations, and spare parts in organized piles that logistics officers tracked and allocated according to priorities. Most importantly, American commanders now understood the German threat and had positioned their forces accordingly to meet it. The element of surprise, never strong given the nature of amphibious operations and the inherent difficulty of concealing the build-up for a major attack, had been completely lost during the fighting on July 10th. American intelligence officers, working from prisoner interrogations, document captures and observation of German movements, had identified the Hermann Goring Division as the main threat and predicted, correctly, that the Germans would renew their attack at dawn. American forces were therefore not merely reacting to German moves, but anticipating them, preparing ambushes and fire plans that would maximize German casualties while minimizing American exposure. The scale of American reinforcement during the night was substantial and would prove decisive to the battle's outcome. Additional infantry battalions came ashore, joining their parent regiments and filling out divisional strength. Artillery batteries established communications with naval fire direction centers, allowing the massive firepower of the fleet to be integrated with land-based artillery in coordinated fire plans that could mass hundreds of guns, land and naval, on single targets. Tank battalions organized into combat teams with infantry and artillery, creating balanced forces capable of both defense and counterattack. The 1st Infantry Division, veteran of North Africa and now gaining experience in opposed amphibious operations, deployed its units with professional competence, taking advantage of terrain, coordinating fires, establishing reserves that could be committed to threatened sectors or to exploit German weaknesses. Dawn on July 11th broke clear and hot, another scorching summer day in Sicily with the sun rising out of the Mediterranean in a sky unmarred by clouds, promising temperatures that would again exceed 40 degrees by afternoon. The renewed German assault began with an artillery barrage that commenced at 0530 hours, batteries of 105mm and 150mm howitzers hammering suspected American positions with high explosive and smoke shells. The ground trembled with the concussions, and pillars of smoke and dust rose above the countryside, drifting slowly in the still morning air. The German gunners, working their pieces with practiced efficiency, maintained rates of fire that consumed their limited ammunition stocks, but that provided the fire support upon which the attack depended. Forward observers, positioned on high ground where they could see American positions, called corrections and shifted fire to new targets as the attack developed. Then, at 0600 hours precisely as operations orders stipulated, the panzers rolled forward once more, their engines roaring their characteristic high-pitched whine, their tracks clanking against the road surface, their guns traversing as commanders searched for targets. The Panzer Grenadiers advanced alongside and behind the tanks, moving in tactical formation with scouts forward, main body following, heavy weapon sections prepared to provide supporting fire. This was the moment of maximum commitment, the point at which all the training, all the doctrine, all the accumulated experience of years of warfare would be tested against an enemy who was determined, well-equipped, and increasingly confident in his own capabilities. The tactical plan for July 11th called for more aggressive action than the previous day, reflecting both the urgency of the situation and the revised assessment of German commanders who now understood American defensive capabilities better. Kampfgruppe Schmalz would again attack along the coastal axis, but this time supported by elements of the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division that had arrived during the night, adding weight and depth to the assault. Kampfgruppe Konrad would push along the northeastern axis, attempting to envelop American positions and create opportunities for exploitation. The artillery would maintain continuous fire on American positions, accepting the rapid consumption of ammunition as necessary to suppress enemy defenses. Air support, promised repeatedly but never delivered in sufficient quantity, was again requested, but expectations were low given the Luftwaffe's weakness over Sicily. The battle that developed on July 11th exceeded even the previous day's fighting in intensity and violence, becoming what survivors on both sides would remember as the most brutal combat of the Sicilian campaign. The German armored thrust, 60 or 70 panzers supported by perhaps 2,000 infantry and backed by all the artillery the division could deploy, aimed directly at the heart of the American beachhead, seeking to split the defenses, reach the coast, and roll up the American positions from the flank. American forces, now firmly established in prepared positions, supported by naval gunfire that had been pre-registered on approach routes, and backed by air support that could respond within minutes to calls from ground controllers, fought with equal determination to hold their positions and maintain the integrity of the beachhead. The flat coastal plain around Gela became a landscape of fire and steel, a mechanized killing ground where armor clashed at ranges from 2,000 meters down to point blank, where infantry fought desperately for survival in foxholes and weapon pits, where artillery fire from both sides turned the air into a maelstrom of flying metal and where death came in 1,000 forms. The fighting developed into a series of battalion and company-level actions, small battles within the larger engagement where individual commanders made split-second decisions that determined whether their men lived or died, where tactical skill and personal courage mattered more than strategic plans or operational concepts. A German tank commander, Feldwebel Anton Müller, a veteran who had fought from France through Russia to Tunisia and who would survive the war to write his memoirs in the 1950s, described the ferocity of the engagement in a diary entry recovered after the war, one of the few detailed first-hand German accounts of the battle. We advanced at dawn, our company of 5 panzers advancing in line abreast, with perhaps 100 meters between vehicles, the formation prescribed by doctrine for attacks across open terrain. Our mission was to break through American lines, reach the coast road, and turn east to roll up their positions. We expected to crush the Americans quickly, as we had crushed so many enemies before, but instead we ran into a wall of fire that exceeded anything in my experience. Anti-tank guns, hidden in positions we had not spotted during our reconnaissance, opened up at 1,000 meters, their shells clanging against our armor. We immediately returned fire, our gunner tracking and engaging targets as fast as our loader could ram shells into the breach. One of our Mark IVs, commanded by my friend Lieutenant Schaefer, burst into flames when a shell penetrated the turret ring, the crew burning inside before they could escape. We could hear their screams on the radio before it went dead. Machine guns swept the ground around us, killing the infantry who tried to advance with us, leaving them lying in the fields or crawling toward whatever cover they could find. We fired back, our 75mm gun pumping shells into American positions, but for every target we destroyed, 2 more appeared. Then the naval fire began again, those massive shells that shook the earth and deafened us inside the tank. Shells that exploded with such force that we were thrown against the interior of the vehicle, even when they landed 50 meters away. My driver was weeping with fear, but he kept going because I ordered him to, and because stopping would mean death. We pressed forward because those were our orders, but we all knew we were not going to reach Gela, not today, probably not ever. The advance of Kampfgruppe Schmalz, the most powerful of the German battle groups with 40 panzers and 1,500 infantry, pushed to within 1 kilometer of Gela's outskirts before being stopped by concentrated American resistance that demonstrated the evolution of American combat capabilities since the North African Campaign. A line of Sherman tanks, positioned hull down behind a low ridge that provided cover while allowing their guns to fire over the crest, engaged the German panzers in a long-range duel that lasted more than an hour. The Shermans, individually inferior to the Mark IVs in armor protection and gun performance, compensated through superior numbers, favorable positions, and increasingly effective coordination of their fire. For every Sherman destroyed, 2 more remained to continue fighting, while German losses could not be similarly replaced. American tank destroyers, specialized vehicles mounting high-velocity 76mm guns in open-top turrets that sacrificed protection for firepower and mobility, moved into firing positions along the German flanks and began systematically destroying the attackers. These vehicles, designed specifically for the anti-tank role, possessed guns capable of penetrating German armor at any combat range and crews trained to exploit their mobility and firepower. They would wait in concealed positions until German panzers exposed their flanks, then dash forward, fire a few rounds and withdraw before German return fire could neutralize them. This aggressive mobile defense disrupted German formations and imposed constant tactical problems that diverted attention from the primary objective. The Panzer Grenadiers, attempting to work around American flanks and create opportunities for the panzers to exploit, found themselves caught in kill zones that American infantry had prepared during the night. Every approach route was covered by interlocking machine gun fire from multiple positions, making movement in the open suicidal. Mortar rounds, fired by American weapons crews who had spent the night registering on likely German assembly areas, dropped among the advancing Germans with deadly accuracy, guided by forward observers who could see every movement and who called for fire with professional competence that matched German standards. American rifle fire, from infantry armed with the semi-automatic M1 Garand rifle that gave individual soldiers firepower exceeding that of German infantry with their bolt-action rifles, swept German formations and forced them to ground. When German infantry attempted to assault American positions using the classic tactics of fire and maneuver that German doctrine prescribed, they found themselves engaging an enemy who would not break as Italian or rear area Soviet units might have broken. American infantry, many of them veterans of North Africa who had already proved themselves in combat, held their ground and fought back with disciplined violence. Machine gunners fired belt after belt of ammunition, their gun barrels glowing red from sustained fire. Riflemen picked off targets methodically, their semi-automatic weapons giving them rates of fire that German infantry could not match. Officers and NCOs moved among their men, directing fire, encouraging the wavering, personally engaging targets when necessary. The American defense was not passive but active, with local counterattacks driving back German penetrations and with constant fire making German consolidation impossible. The German assault, despite its ferocity and despite the professional competence of the attacking troops, was being ground down by superior American firepower and by defensive preparations that had turned the approaches to Gela into a kill zone. By mid-morning, with the sun climbing toward its zenith and temperatures soaring, the attack had lost its momentum. German units found themselves pinned down, unable to advance but reluctant to withdraw, absorbing casualties without making corresponding progress. Command and control began to fray as radio antennas were shot away, as commanders were killed or wounded, as the fog of war descended and units lost contact with higher headquarters and with neighboring formations. Kampfgruppe Konrad, attacking along the northeastern axis with perhaps 30 panzers and 1,000 infantry, fared no better than Schmalz's force. Its lead elements ran into a prepared defensive position held by the 16th Infantry Regiment of the 1st Infantry Division, a unit that had earned its reputation through combat in North Africa and that had no intention of yielding ground to any attacker, German or otherwise. American infantry fought from foxholes and weapon pits that had been dug during the night, their positions sighted to provide mutual support and to cover all likely German approach routes. Artillery, both divisional batteries firing from positions several kilometers behind the front line and naval guns firing from ships offshore, had been registered on the approaches and could be called down within minutes of the first German appearance. The fighting that developed along Kampfgruppe Konrad's axis demonstrated the evolution of combined arms warfare and the increasing importance of firepower coordination in modern combat. When German panzers appeared at ranges of 1,500 to 2,000 meters, American forward observers immediately called for artillery fire, and within minutes, shells were falling among the German formations. When the panzers closed to assault range, American anti-tank guns and tank destroyers engaged them with direct fire, forcing the panzers to halt and fight rather than maintain momentum. When German infantry attempted to advance, American machine guns and mortars swept the approaches, inflicting casualties and breaking up formations. At every phase of the attack, American defensive fire disrupted German efforts and imposed delays that allowed more firepower to be brought to bear. The intensity of combat along this axis exceeded anything in Feldwebel Müller's diary, but other accounts preserved in unit histories and after-action reports paint a picture of sustained violence that extracted a terrible cost from both sides. German casualties mounted steadily as the morning progressed. Tank commanders killed by sniper fire while standing in their open cupolas to maintain situational awareness. Infantry cut down by machine gun fire while attempting to cross open ground. Artillerymen killed at their guns by American counter-battery fire. Panzers burned after being hit by American anti-tank fire, their ammunition exploding in secondary detonations that sent turrets flying through the air. Half-tracks, caught in the open by American fire, erupted in flames that incinerated their crews and passengers. The human cost of modern mechanized warfare, the industrial-scale killing that characterized mid-war combat, was on full display in the fields and villages around Gela. By noon on July 11th, with 6 hours of continuous combat, having achieved no appreciable results, and with casualties mounting past any sustainable level, General Major Konrad recognized that the counterattack had failed decisively and irreversibly. The Hermann Goring Division had suffered heavy casualties without achieving its objective, had expended its combat power against defenses that had not broken, and now faced the prospect of complete destruction if fighting continued. American forces were not only firmly established ashore, but were actually expanding their beachhead as additional forces landed and moved inland, their strength growing hourly while German capabilities diminished with every casualty and destroyed vehicle. The division had lost more than 24 panzers destroyed or damaged beyond immediate repair during the morning's fighting alone, losses that, when combined with previous days' casualties, reduced the division's armor strength by nearly half. These were not merely statistical losses, but represented the destruction of Germany's most powerful weapons, each tank representing thousands of hours of skilled labor, scarce raw materials including chrome, manganese and molybdenum that Germany could barely access, and fuel that was increasingly difficult to procure. The loss of tank crews, men trained over months and experienced through years of combat, was even more irreparable than the loss of vehicles. Germany could perhaps build new tanks given time and resources, but could not replace experienced panzer crews whose skills had been developed through years of service. Casualties among the Panzer Grenadiers exceeded 600 men killed and wounded during the 2 days of fighting, representing nearly 15% of the division's infantry strength. These numbers, while modest by the catastrophic standards of battles on the Eastern Front, where divisions could lose thousands of men in single actions, were unsustainable for a division already below authorized strength and operating far from reinforcement pipelines. More significantly, the casualties fell disproportionately on combat units, particularly on the rifle companies and platoons that bore the brunt of the fighting, and among junior leaders, the sergeants and lieutenants whose small unit leadership was essential to German tactical effectiveness. The supply situation was deteriorating rapidly toward crisis, with ammunition stocks depleted to levels that would preclude sustained operations, even if the tactical situation somehow improved. Tank ammunition, particularly the anti-tank rounds that were effective against American armor, had been consumed at rates far exceeding peacetime planning factors, with some panzers having fired their entire basic load and more during the morning's engagement. Artillery ammunition, expended at rates exceeding 100 rounds per gun per day, had drawn down division stocks to the point where rationing would be necessary if the division were to maintain any artillery capability at all. Small arms ammunition, while more plentiful, had also been consumed in vast quantities during 2 days of intense combat. Fuel reserves, already concerning before the attack, were now critical, with barely enough remaining to allow the division to maneuver to defensive positions inland. The fuel trucks that had risked American air attack to bring supplies forward had suffered losses to strafing attacks, reducing the division's already limited capacity to move fuel from rear area depots to forward units. Without substantial resupply, which would require days to organize and execute given the inadequate road network and constant American air interdiction, the Hermann Goring Division would be effectively immobilized within 48 hours. The order to withdraw came at noon on July 11th. German units, maintaining their tactical cohesion despite the defeat, pulled back from their advanced positions in good order. The Americans, exhausted by 2 days of continuous combat and wary of German capabilities, did not immediately pursue. The withdrawal, conducted under the cover of screening forces and what little artillery support remained available, proceeded without degenerating into a rout. Professional soldiers, the Germans maintained their discipline even in retreat, a testament to the quality of their training and leadership. By evening, the Hermann Goring Division had established new defensive positions several kilometers inland, beyond the immediate range of naval gunfire, but still capable of contesting further American advances. The human cost of the Battle of Gela was severe for both sides, but particularly heavy for the Germans. The Hermann Goring Division suffered approximately 800 casualties killed, wounded, and missing during the 2 days of fighting. The loss of armor was proportionally even more significant, with 31 panzers destroyed or damaged beyond immediate repair. Several batteries of artillery had been overrun or forced to abandon their guns during the withdrawal. The division's combat effectiveness, already questionable given its inexperience and hasty reconstitution after Tunisia, had been shattered. It would require weeks of rest and refitting before the unit could again be committed to sustained operations. Italian casualties were harder to calculate given the wholesale collapse of coastal defense units, but thousands of Italian soldiers surrendered during the first days of the invasion, removing entire battalions from the order of battle. The performance of Italian units at Gela reinforced German perceptions of their allies' unreliability, further poisoning a relationship that had been deteriorating since the debacles in Greece and North Africa. From this point forward, German commanders would plan operations in Sicily with the assumption that Italian units could not be counted upon for serious defensive efforts. American casualties at Gela, while substantial, were manageable given the size of the invasion force. The 1st Infantry Division suffered approximately 250 casualties on July 10th and 11th, while supporting units added perhaps another 100. More significantly, the Americans had demonstrated their ability to conduct large-scale amphibious operations against determined opposition, maintain combat effectiveness under heavy counterattacks, and coordinate complex fire support from multiple sources. The lessons learned at Gela would inform American amphibious operations for the remainder of the war. The material losses on both sides reflected the increasingly industrial nature of modern warfare. The Germans lost 31 panzers at Gela, tanks that German industry, despite operating under round-the-clock aerial bombardment, struggled to replace. Each destroyed Mark IV represented thousands of man-hours of labor, scarce raw materials, and increasingly precious fuel. The Americans lost fewer armored vehicles but could absorb such losses more easily, given the vast productive capacity of the United States. A destroyed Sherman tank would be replaced within weeks by a new vehicle rolling off assembly lines in Detroit or Pittsburgh. The strategic consequences of the Battle of Gela extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. The failure of the German counterattack meant that the Allied lodgment on Sicily was secure. From this beachhead, American and British forces would expand their control over the island, eventually capturing Palermo on July 22nd and Messina on August 17th. The loss of Sicily opened the Mediterranean sea lanes fully to Allied shipping, eliminated the threat to Malta, and positioned Allied forces for future operations against the Italian mainland. For Germany, the defeat signaled the beginning of a fighting retreat up the Italian peninsula that would last until the war's end. The battle also exposed fundamental weaknesses in German strategic thinking. The commitment of the Hermann Goring Division to a hasty counterattack without adequate reconnaissance, insufficient artillery support, and in the face of overwhelming enemy firepower, represented a triumph of offensive spirit over tactical common sense. German doctrine emphasized the counterattack as the principal means of restoring a defensive situation. But at Gela, the Americans had landed with such force and prepared such strong positions that even elite German troops could not prevail. The lesson, if German commanders had been willing to learn it, was that firepower and logistics increasingly trumped elan and tactical skill in modern warfare. The failure at Gela had psychological consequences as well. For 3 years, the Wehrmacht had maintained an aura of invincibility, a reputation built on lightning victories in Poland, France, and the Balkans, and on dogged resistance in Russia and North Africa. The inability to throw the Allies back into the sea in Sicily, coming so soon after the surrender in Tunisia, suggested that German arms were no longer capable of dictating events on the battlefield. Morale among German troops in Sicily, never high given the manifest impossibility of holding the island indefinitely, deteriorated further after Gela. Soldiers began to question whether the sacrifices demanded of them served any achievable purpose. For the German commanders, the Battle of Gela represented a preview of the challenges that would define the remainder of the war. They faced enemies with vast material superiority, complete air dominance, and the ability to project enormous firepower onto any battlefield. The defensive advantages that had partially compensated for numerical inferiority in Russia and Africa were less relevant when naval guns could obliterate defensive positions from ranges beyond German artillery's reach. The strategic mobility that had been the hallmark of German success in earlier campaigns was meaningless when Allied aircraft destroyed bridges, strafed convoys, and interdicted supply routes. The Italian perspective on Gela was one of deepening disillusionment with the war and with their German allies. The collapse of Italian coastal defenses, while partly attributable to poor equipment and training, also reflected the simple reality that most Italian soldiers no longer believed in the cause for which they were fighting. The fascist regime's promises of Mediterranean empire and renewed Roman glory rang hollow after 3 years of defeats. The German reaction to Italian failures, often expressed in terms of contempt rather than constructive assistance, further alienated the Allies. Within weeks of the Battle of Gela, negotiations for an Italian armistice would be underway, leading to Italy's surrender in September and its transformation from Axis partner to German-occupied territory. The tactical lessons of Gela were clear to professional soldiers on both sides. Amphibious assaults, properly planned and executed with overwhelming force, could establish secure lodgements even against determined opposition. Naval gunfire, when carefully coordinated with ground forces, provided devastating fire support that could suppress enemy counterattacks and enable friendly maneuver. Air superiority, exercised ruthlessly, multiplied the effectiveness of all other capabilities. For the Germans, the lesson was equally stark. Without control of the sea and air, defensive operations along coastlines were ultimately futile. Every subsequent German defense in Italy, France, and eventually Germany itself would be conducted under similar conditions of Allied air and naval supremacy. The Battle of Gela thus stands as a significant engagement not for its scale, which was modest compared to the great battles on the Eastern Front, but for what it revealed about the evolving character of the war. It demonstrated that German tactical excellence, while still formidable, could no longer overcome Allied material superiority and operational competence. It showed that amphibious operations, the most complex and risky of military undertakings, could be executed successfully against serious opposition, and it marked another step in Germany's long retreat from the strategic overreach that had carried Wehrmacht columns to the gates of Moscow and the banks of the Volga. In the years since 1943, historians have debated whether the German counterattack at Gela ever had a realistic chance of success. Some argue that with better coordination, more concentrated force, and earlier execution, the Hermann Goring Division might have reached the beaches and inflicted serious damage on the American lodgment. Others contend that the overwhelming Allied superiority in men, material, and firepower made German success impossible regardless of tactical execution. What is certain is that the commanders and soldiers who fought at Gela did so with professional competence and personal courage, even as they served a regime whose strategic ambitions had brought Germany to the brink of catastrophe. The soldiers of the Hermann Goring Division having failed to throw the Americans back into the sea, would continue fighting in Sicily for another 5 weeks before evacuating to the Italian mainland. There they would fight on through the grinding battles of Salerno, Cassino, and Anzio, retreating slowly up the peninsula until Germany's final surrender in May 1945. For most of them, Gela was just another battle in a war that had long since lost any connection to rational political objectives. They fought because they were soldiers, because their training and culture demanded it, and because by the summer of 1943 there was nothing else to do. The American forces that defended the beachhead at Gela would go on to campaign through Sicily, then participate in the invasions of Italy and France. The 1st Infantry Division, having proven its mettle once again, would land on Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944, where it would face defenses far more formidable than those at Gela. The lessons learned in Sicily about coordinating fire support, maintaining momentum after landing, and exploiting air and naval superiority would inform every subsequent amphibious operation the Allies conducted. In the final accounting, the Battle of Gela was a decisive Allied victory that confirmed the success of the Sicilian invasion and opened the road to Italy. For Germany, it was another defeat in a lengthening series, another indicator that the strategic initiative had passed irretrievably to the Allies. The panzers that burned on the approaches to Gela represented not just tactical losses, but symptoms of a war that Germany could no longer win. The soldiers who died there, German and American alike, sacrificed their lives in a struggle whose outcome, by July 1943, was no longer seriously in doubt. History would record that their courage and skill merited respect, even as it acknowledged that the cause for which the Germans fought was both criminal and doomed.